The Soviet Union, along with its empire, collapsed over 30 years ago in the December of 1991. In this video, we'll be graphing the economic aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. The Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, was founded in 1991 in the wake of the failed coup attempt. The CIS would be the legal successor to the Soviet Union. Of the 15 republics that made up the Soviet Union, all would join or participate in the CIS, with the exception of the Baltic states. Participation and membership in the CIS more or less assured close political and economic ties with the former power centers in Moscow. Involvement in the CIS was almost entirely dictated by geography. The gravity well of Moscow may prove inescapable for the countries of Ukraine, Belarus, for the small Western Asian countries of the Caucasus region, and for the isolated, landlocked nations of Central Asia. In contrast, the states of the former Warsaw Pact, located further west towards Europe's heartland, would, all with the exception of Albania, join the European Union and the Western sphere of political and economic influence. Using economic data, we will graph the trajectories of these countries in the decades after the close of the Soviet experiment. Ultimately, the Soviet Union failed because it failed to compete economically, hindered by ideological limitations, corruption, and the hubris of central planning. Although the West and the European Union are coming under increased scrutiny for their political and economic policies, perhaps increasingly ideological policies that drift further away from the winning free market formula, we can use the aftermath as a controlled experiment. Who emerged as winners and who was left behind in the wake of the greatest ideological and economic experiment in history. Here, we have a bubble graph plotting 2023 GDP and population data. Moving from west to east, farthest west, we have the countries of the former Warsaw Pact and the Baltic states. Then moving east, we have the East Slavic countries of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, followed by the West Asian countries in the Caucasus region, and finally the countries of Central Asia. The size of the bubble indicates the size of the population. Russia dwarfs them all with a population of approximately 144 million people, nearly 4 times greater than the other large countries of Poland, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan, which have populations of around 37 million. The 2023 GDP of Russia is approximately 2.5 times larger than the second largest GDP of Poland. Because of this, we will largely exclude Russia from the discussion when comparing GDP and population metrics. Population size is of course important when assessing a country's GDP. Smaller countries with smaller populations will tend to have smaller GDPs, all else being equal. Excluding Russia, we find that GDP size and wealth is greater the further west we go. The natural resource-rich Kazakhstan, a petrostate, is the only country not in the Western sphere of influence with a GDP greater than 200 billion. There are 4 countries of the former Warsaw Pact, Poland, Czechia, Romania, and Hungary, with GDPs over 200 billion. Ukraine, despite its large population size of around 37 million, has a smaller GDP than Hungary, which only has a population of around 10 million people. Uzbekistan, with a population of 36 million, has a GDP less than half that of Hungary. When evaluating GDP per capita, we see a similar trend. With the exception of Albania, a non-EU member, we see that all countries in the Western sphere have GDP per capita of greater than 15,000 US dollars. In the East, only Russia and Kazakhstan come close, both at around 14,000 US dollars. With the exception of the petrostates, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, the countries of Central Asia have GDP per capita of well below 5,000 US dollars. Ukraine, with a decade of war a contributing factor, also has a GDP per capita of less than 5,000 US dollars. Despite a similar population size, the GDP trend over the last 30 years for Poland, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan paints 3 different pictures of economic development. In 1992, Poland and Ukraine had similar GDPs and levels of industrialization. In 2023, the GDP of Poland is now 4.5 times larger than Ukraine's. Soviet Central Asia was often neglected and generally much less industrialized when compared with the more Western Soviet republics. The GDP of Uzbekistan in 1992 was around 13 billion, compared with the 70 to 90 billion GDPs of Ukraine and Poland. We'll go back to the beginning, to 1995, the first year for which there exists data for all of these countries, and examine their economic starting points. As was often the case with communism, all republics were equal, but some were more equal than the others. To demonstrate the East-West divide, here we have grouped these countries according to their population and have graphed their GDPs from west to east. Immediately, we can notice a trend. In the less than 4 million population group, we find that the GDP of Lithuania in 1995 was 5.4 times greater than Armenia. In the 4 to 6 million population group, Slovakia's GDP was 15.5 times greater than Kyrgyzstan. In the 7 to 11 million group, Czechia's GDP was 25 times higher than Azerbaijan, and in the 15 to 22 million group, Romania's GDP was 2.8 times greater than Uzbekistan. Even before the October Revolution, the states to the west had greater levels of industrialization due to their proximity to the powerful and sophisticated industrial centers of Germany. This head start carried through into the Soviet period and on into the modern era. The wide range of the 1995 GDP data requires a logarithmic scale. Here we see that the Western Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, had relatively high starting GDPs. Moving west from there, we find an almost stepwise increase in GDP as we get closer to Germany. Moving east from Russia, with the exception of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, we find countries that entered the post-Soviet period with GDPs less than $3 billion. But there is some optimism to be had. Generally, it will be easier for a country with a very small GDP to double or triple in size. We will keep this in mind when looking at GDP growth. What growth multiples did these countries experience in the following decades? From 1995 until 2023, we find that the countries of West Asia experienced some of the highest growth multiples for GDP. These countries started with GDPs of 3 billion or less, leading to their explosion in growth following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Most notably, we find that the small nations Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan have the highest GDP growth multiples due to their abundant natural gas reserves. Kazakhstan, also a petrostate, has a lower growth multiple in comparison due to its much higher starting GDP. The Western aligned states all have growth multiples in the range of 5 to 10. Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia are at or below 5 times. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, despite their low starting GDPs, have growth multiples more similar to the more developed Western countries, suggesting slow economic development when compared with the small countries of West Asia. If we instead turn our attention to the last decade, we find a normalization in the GDP growth. Notably, Belarus, Russia, and Azerbaijan have experienced virtually no growth in the last 10 years. Most countries have a growth multiple of around 1.5, while a couple, Armenia and Kyrgyzstan, have approximately doubled in size. For the more developed countries in the Western sphere, this is to be expected. As a country transitions from a developing country to a developed country, growth rates generally decline. For reference, the US also has a growth multiple of around 1.6 for the last decade, while China and India are at 1.7. However, for the less developed countries of Central Asia, this may be an ominous sign. What trends can we find when we evaluate the stability of GDP growth? Here, we have plotted GDP over time and performed a linear regression. R squared, the coefficient of determination, determines how linear and predictable GDP growth has been for these countries. The closer the R squared value is to 1, the more predictable and linear the data. GDP growth stability indicates the economic fundamentals of a country, and stable economic growth is attractive for foreign investment capital. For brevity, here we have the combined R squared values for each region. We find that the former Warsaw Pact and Baltic states have R squared values of 0.93, indicating high growth stability. For reference, the US has an R squared value of 0.97. We see a sharp drop for the East Slavic region at 0.7. Similarly, Russia has an R squared value of 0.74. This trend then reverses in the eastern direction with 0.81 and 0.86 for the West Asian and Central Asian regions respectively. A number of these states, Russia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, are petrostates. When we examine the fluctuations in the oil and gas prices, we see that these regions are significantly affected by price swings in the commodity markets. This graph presents the R squared values, a proxy for GDP growth stability. For all countries, we can quickly see that countries in the Western sphere of influence have R squared values of around 0.9. Further to the east, it becomes more chaotic. Here, a number of factors contribute, including war, Western sanctions, overdependence on natural resources, namely oil and gas, as well as other factors related to corruption. Turkmenistan will prove to be somewhat of an outlier. The Hermit Kingdom of Turkmenistan, the North Korea of Central Asia, has very stable GDP growth despite being a petrostate. Here we have a bubble graph examining GDP stability and corruption. The Corruption Perception Index, the CPI, from Transparency International, is a metric for assessing the extent of corruption in a country. A higher number is better, and it indicates a lower level of corruption. The countries in the European Union have relatively low levels of corruption, with most having CPI values greater than 50. Although Georgia and Armenia have corruption levels comparable to the European Union, the rest of the countries in the East have much higher levels of corruption. Turkmenistan again proves to be an outlier. Despite having the worst level of corruption, with a CPI value of 19, they're able to maintain stable GDP growth. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan also have high levels of corruption while maintaining reasonably stable GDP growth. Despite this, we assume that the high levels of corruption hinder economic growth. Corruption contributes to inefficiencies and the misallocation of resources. We can also examine how these economies break down by sector: services, industry, and agriculture. Industry includes both manufacturing as well as mining, energy, and natural resource extraction. Generally, more developed countries will have a larger percentage from services and industry, while less developed countries may rely more on agriculture. We'll dig deeper in the following section. How much does a country's GDP depend on natural resource extraction? Here, we have a bubble graph plotting GDP stability and natural resource rents as a percentage of GDP, a metric for assessing the economic dependence on natural resources. The countries in the West are all very low in this metric, and they all have a high R-squared for GDP growth. We can also point out that these countries have little in the way of natural resources to begin with. Free of this temptation, attention can be focused on economic investment and diversification, further contributing to stable GDP growth. In the East, we find that Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan have a high level of economic dependence on their natural resources, while Russia and Uzbekistan have a moderate dependence. A strong manufacturing and industrial base contributes to economic diversification. Here we examine manufacturing value added as a percentage of GDP. The MVA is a metric for assessing the manufacturing and industrial capacity of a country. For the European Union countries, the majority are in the range of 15 to 20%. Once again in the East, we find a greater degree of variation, with Azerbaijan at 5%, while Belarus and Uzbekistan have levels more comparable to the countries in the European Union. Finally, we examine agriculture. Here we compare GDP per capita with the percentage of employment that comes from agriculture. Agricultural jobs are often low paid. Countries further down the developmental ladder often have a large amount of their workforce employed in agriculture. We find that countries that are high in this metric fall towards the bottom of the GDP per capita scale. Romania is an exception at 24%, despite having a relatively high GDP per capita at $18,000. Finally, we will give an economic rank to these countries. We will evaluate them based on growth stability, corruption, GDP, population, GDP per capita, and natural resource dependence. Despite its problems, the sheer size of the Russian GDP and population place it at the top of the list at number 1. Compared to Poland, the second largest GDP by far, Russia's GDP is 2.5 times greater than Poland, while its population is 4 times greater. After Russia, we find that all the countries that are current members of the European Union ranked at the top of the list. Kazakhstan is the top-ranked CIS country, other than Russia, and is ranked in 8th place. The bottom of the ranking is populated by the CIS countries in the East. Azerbaijan is ranked the lowest. Despite its relatively strong GDP, its economic stability, high levels of corruption, and over-reliance on natural resources put it at the bottom. This ranking is subjective, and different methods and weightings could be used to rank these countries economically. Purely in terms of GDP, at around 5 times lower than Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have the smallest economies. Just as the page turned on the Soviet Empire, the page may be turning on the American unipolar moment, in which the U.S. was the sole hyperpower. We may find in the coming decades a new realignment, both politically and economically. Since the days of the Great Game, the struggle between the British Empire and the Russian Empire for control over Central Asia, the countries of Central Asia have long been pushed off the path of self-determination. With Russia distracted by its war in Ukraine, a power vacuum may emerge. China increasingly competes for influence in Central Asia, primarily through economic means, having established extensive trade relations with these countries. Although the influence of Russia and China cannot be discounted, a third potential influence may grow, one for which these countries have a greater cultural affinity. Azerbaijan and the Central Asian countries, with the exception of Tajikistan, are all Turkic-speaking nations. Backed by a regional economic and military power, Turkey, we may see greater competition in this region due to the formation of the Organization of Turkic States, an organization created in 2009 to further the goal of promoting cooperation between the Turkic-speaking peoples. Together, their combined negotiating power could bring a better, more secure future for the region. The futures of Armenia and Georgia are more uncertain. In the past decade, Armenia's enemy, Azerbaijan, has grown rich. The chaos of the war in Ukraine, coupled with its greater resources, allowed Azerbaijan to finally claim the contested territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. The former security pact between Russia and Armenia seems to now be in the wind. Further to the north, Georgia is also at a crossroads. From under the shadow of Russia and neighboring its most volatile regions, Georgia may remain in limbo for the foreseeable future. Belarus is the most dependent on Russia, both politically and economically. We can expect that this will continue into the future, or maybe that the ties will grow even stronger. The aging president of Belarus, when his 30-plus year tenure inevitably comes to a close, could even see the country's population of 9 million people absorbed into the Russian Federation. The fate of Ukraine is perhaps the most uncertain of all. Regardless of the outcomes of the war, the continued instability in Ukraine may likely continue into the future. For the former Warsaw Pact and Baltic states, their future will be dictated by their continued tensions with Brussels and by the military threat from the East. A pragmatism and an appreciation for their still recently attained sovereignty often places them at odds with the old money power centers of Western Europe. If decades of dubious economic and social policies do bring down the European Union, we could expect these countries in Central and Eastern Europe to blaze their own path. Whether the decadence Marx warned of is inevitable, time will tell.